All right. Good morning, everyone. Want to give a lecture on chapter 12 and try to get through it as quickly as possible. Um, but there's some really important concepts to cover in this particular chapter that give you a sense of all of the consequences and difficulties that surround food production. Because basically, like as a society, we've organized and we feed ourselves through a social collective in terms of effort. And so, just like we talked about the Green Revolution and what has that done that's good, and what has that brought that is a challenge now in the environmental landscape. So, let's get started. Um, One of the beginning pieces of the chapter talks about growing power, which is um, a or which was, I should say, a nonprofit that was started in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. By he was a professional, I think, basketball player or a high level college basketball player, but really decided to give back and was um, must have been in farming, but he started a nonprofit that was looking at producing urban farms, and it seemed really hopeful. But like in upon looking further into it, his organization is closed. He still does a lot of work toward. See, this is him right here, Will Allen. He still does a lot of work toward raising awareness about urban farming, and one of the things that this is really focusing in on, and what the book wants to share, is that there is a lack of urban agriculture. Obviously, that kind of seems to be like, well, duh, because you develop the land, you put in urban space, you have a lot of infrastructure, a lot of paving and buildings and transportation, and water transportation even has to be like like a lot of times rivers that go through big cities will be channelized so that it's predictable and you don't have this natural open space. So of course, it kind of goes hand in hand that we don't see food production happening in urban spaces. However, that creates something that is referred to as a food desert. And this is, as it says, an urban area where people have little to no easy access to nutritious food. And basically, the difficulty is with our particular with like the landscape, as we as a society have seen these patterns arise in what we do to land as we develop it, is that we use open spaces for agriculture, and those are typically not within urban centers. And then you have suburban areas, and the agricultural lands are on the outside of that. So you can kind of, picture this like urban, suburban, and then the agricultural land on the outside of that. And often what we find is that the more developed the land gets, like our urban centers, can be a metropolis and it may be really developed. But often within that urban place, there's a lot of pockets of poverty, industrialization, or things that are in industry within those really highly developed urban centers. And there is a lack of movement of fresh food into those spaces. And so like the new grocery stores and the infrastructure of moving food around will often be very developed and very robust within the suburban areas, but there's a loss of that going into the urban centers. So this leads to this first question: why is good nutrition important? And obviously, we're biological beings; we need to eat, but calories are calories, right? Not necessarily, and but we'll kind of go into a little bit of that. Many people in less developed countries have health problems from not getting enough food, and then kind of ironically, but in a terrible juxtaposition, many people in more developed countries actually suffer from health problems from eating too much, having too much around, and not really um, putting those stops in place. And the greatest obstacle to providing enough food for everyone come out of our own human behaviors and some of the worst aspects of society. So, poverty obviously is going to give um, people like it's going to make it difficult for them to get the food that they need. War, not only because it takes resources, but also interrupts um, trade between countries. Bad weather obviously can ruin crops, damage crops that are there, and so those, and then within that, climate change as well, because as climate is shifting, the needs of particular agricultural spaces and lands, those are shifting, and we don't always have the technology or the resources to respond to those shifts in a timely manner. um, so this right here, I just wanted to share with you, is a picture that just kind of, I want you to really look at it and let it sink in. When we look at nutrition, and you think of like the quintessential loss of nutrition, starvation because of famine is one of the scariest things as a human society. This is a famine that was actually caused by a civil war. It's been going on consistently for a very long time in Somalia, um, basically since the 90s. And there's still unrest. And there's a lot of loss of life surrounding this because crops get destroyed. Resources go into fighting instead of into building infrastructure or into like investing in a growing generation. But this is what chronic famine can do, and this is what chronic starvation would look like on a person and a body. Obviously, that human is not thriving. Neither one of them look like they're super healthy, um, and so it is a sad reality. Excuse me. Many people suffer from in the world. Many people do suffer from lasting hunger and malnutrition, and so we want to talk about what that looks like specifically biologically. Not having enough calories is going to be a matter of not getting the macronutrients that you need. So, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. But then there's also this component of micronutrients and making sure that, so not just undernutrition, but malnutrition is an issue. The micronutrients are things like vitamins, like vitamin A, B, C, E, and minerals, like trace elements that are needed in your body to create or to synthesize smaller components into larger molecules that are needed for particular biofunctions. You basically, um, you know, you take in carbohydrates and you break down those carbohydrates, but it makes like the breaking down of your carbohydrates can make it makes little precursors, and then you take in food, and your body is able to synthesize and put little pieces into larger pieces, molecules that your body needs. But if you're missing components, like we talked about this last week, Liebig's law of the minimum, if there's one piece that's missing, you're not able to synthesize all of the nutrients that you need. And therefore, some metabolic functions are going to be interrupted, whether that be like just daily living and growth. But oftentimes we see diseases from malnutrition, from not having a particular dietary component that is needed to fulfill your own metabolic needs. So, chronic undernutrition is not getting enough food in terms of energy. So, it's the caloric intake, not having enough calories in order to meet your energy needs. Chronic malnutrition would be not having enough of the other key nutrients. So, proteins or things that it could be elements that you need in order to put those proteins together. So, your body makes some amino acids, but there's 9 essential amino acids, essential meaning that you cannot make them, that they actually have to come from your food. And if you're not getting them in your food, then that's malnutrition. Famine is a condition where there is a severe shortage of food because there are crop failures, and that can be due to drought or that can be due to flooding. And often in areas where there is a lot of conflict, it is actually due to war causing things to be out of order. This can cause mass starvation, many deaths. It can send a country into economic chaos, and it can cause a lot of social disruptions. And we do see these things happening in the world currently. Close close to 2 billion people are deficient in one or more vitamins and minerals, and those are those trace pieces. Some people have too little iron. This causes anemia. Some people with iodine, you can actually, not having enough iodine can cause thyroid dysfunction, and can cause like people to be shorter than they should be. Like you have a genetic capacity for your height or your growth as a child, and a lot of people that come from countries that have chronic poverty never meet those genetic potentials. They just don't get enough of something, whether it's calories or whether it's nutrients. They're not getting enough of something, and they're not developing like to their full physical potential. And so that is something that's actually a measured component of society that we need to address. The power of environmental science is finding solutions for these social problems that are based in science. So it's more than just learning about how things work, but also how we can work to create systems and create relationships between countries and teach people about their long-term needs and how to like better things for their families and for their communities and for basically for their societies as whole. um this one's pretty obvious. It's not difficult to go through, but some of these terms you need to understand. Overnutrition is the excess body fat from too many calories and too little exercise. Similar health problems to those that are underfed is that there's a lower life expectancy, greater susceptibility to disease and illness, and lower productivity and life quality. So there are areas where, okay, like they get enough food, there isn't famine, but they don't necessarily have um, let's say, like culturally or traditionally, then they have enough food, so they're going to eat, but they're not in a place educationally where they're eating the right foods or the right proportions. And so then you have a lot of health problems that come from just having a little bit too much. Um, for hunger and malnutrition, and even sometimes overnutrition, poverty is the root cause. But when we're dealing with like not having enough, poverty is the root cause of hunger and malnutrition. Half of the world's population struggle to survive on about $2.25 per day. And I think I already gave you this statistic that 40% of the world's population live in like abject poverty. Like they do not have enough. Poverty prevents daily access to nutritious food. There are a lot of other obstacles that come into play as well. But poverty can be caused by these as well. Um, so, one of the things that we talked about earlier on, right, was the Green Revolution. And that would be like how we've used high input industrialized agriculture. And that has created more access to food worldwide, but we still have a long way to go. And low input traditional agriculture is effective as well, like what we would refer to in our society and what we're familiar with as like homesteading, right? That those have greatly increased food supplies. There are three systems that produce the most of our food worldwide. Okay, so you think about this systematically, you understand like the structure of the way that we have organized this as humans. Croplands. Most croplands are used for grain, primarily rice, wheat, and corn. And a lot of the corn especially, is used to feed what's being grown on rangelands. And number two would be rangelands, pastures, and feedlots. This is where meat is produced, meat and meat products. And then fisheries and aquaculture, those provide fish products. So there's three big agricultural industries that you need to think about. So crops, rangelands, and fisheries. Important technological advances that have supported the growth of these particular industries: irrigation, synthetic fertilizers, and pesticides. And I know we've talked about those recently as well. Okay, let's deal with the first of those. So, industrialist crop production. This is large scale, um, factory strategies, production of crops. So, like this is like taking a factory and turning all the big land into like how can I produce the most of this? And so, the obvious answer is monoculture. Mono meaning one. This uses heavy equipment. This is how we've gotten to where we are in terms of food production. Large investments of financial capital have to go in first. There's a high use of fossil fuels. A lot of water is used in the irrigation methodologies. A lot of inorganic fertilizers because using the land all the time without replenishing it. If it's not happening naturally, we've got to replenish the soil synthetically, and that is through the use of synthetic, like the cheapest synthetic fertilizers. I talked about kind of switching over factories that were being used to produce explosives